I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the Charter School Marketplace and introduce you to a longtime associate. I believe the first time we worked together was probably in 2000. So it's been about a quarter of a century now since we converted the Phoenix Academy from a private school to a public charter school. So this is Jay Sharpe, CPA. I'm not sure how many other letters you have after your name. As a CPA, usually there are a ton. So if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your family and your hobbies and interests first.
Absolutely, Paul. My name is Jay Sharpe. I'm the audit partner for Sharpe Patel. Appreciate you having me on podcast today. Currently I reside in Raleigh with my wife and kids. So 2023 is kind of a transition year for my family. Had two kids. I have twins that went to college, and then I had a 5-year-old that started kindergarten. And so I got a little separation of education there for my kids. I have both my kids are attending community college right now, and my daughter is getting ready to go into UNC Wilmington in the fall. So we're excited about that. But some of my hobbies, what I do in my spare time when I'm not working, like to golf a little bit when I get a chance. Haven't golfed as much as I wanted to the last couple of years, but trying to get back into that. Like to spend some time with my family down at the beach, whether it's boating or going to the beach or going out to local restaurants. I always enjoy getting back down to the beach as much as possible. And probably my third hobby is music. I love music. Listening to music. I play the guitar a little bit, not very good, but when I get some spare time, I mess around with the guitar. But that's kind of my hobbies and a little bit about my family.
Great. Well, how about where did you go to college and some of your early career background?
Yeah, so I was lucky to attend UNC Wilmington. I got my degree in accountancy, both undergrad and graduate from them. Graduated back in the late 90s. And from there, my first job was actually with the state. I worked with the Office of State Auditor in their Greenville and Wilmington locations, auditing or assisting to audit, various government agencies, community colleges, universities. It was kind of strange because within a year of graduating from UNC Wilmington, I was actually auditing UNC Wilmington. So kind of the reverse side there. So kind of neat there. One of my funnest audits I had with the state was auditing the battleship in downtown Wilmington. And that was kind of fun. We were actually on the battleship doing the audit, and we had some like tourists going around looking at us like, hey, there's people in there moving. Didn't realize we were not part of the tour, but just actually in there auditing. So I started my career out there. About 2.5 years into that, after I met my wife down in Wilmington, we decided to move to Raleigh to better our careers. And since then, I've been kind of working with various CPA firms for about 20 years. And then back in 2020, right before the pandemic hit, good timing there, me and my business partner, Aaron Patel, decided to start our own firm. We feel like we had done enough in the CPA industry and worked with firms and got enough experience where we felt we could run our own firm. We had learned a lot of what worked and what didn't work. And so we started out with 6 folks in our Charlotte and Raleigh offices. And today we actually have 2 people starting on Monday. We'll be up to 30 staff throughout our offices. We were able to actually acquire an office down in Wilmington. I'm a little biased. This Wilmington thing's going to keep on coming up. I really love the area. But we were able to acquire an office down in Wilmington back in September. We're going to continue to try to have our footprint throughout the state of North Carolina. And we'll be looking to opening or acquiring more offices throughout the state in larger regions moving forward.
That's fantastic. Because we started working with you and your core group of people way back when, and anytime you switched firms, we went with you because this business, charter schools, and you always did things correctly, above board, square, and straight. So we're glad to we were still glad to continue to work with you at your current firm, which is fantastic. It's mushrooming. That sounds fantastic. So what services does Sharpe Patel offer? What does the firm offer?
Yeah, so like I said, we're a 30-person firm. Generally categorized as a smaller firm, and we're going to continue to grow. But we are a full-service CPA firm. our main services are audit services and tax services. With tax, it's businesses and individuals. We offer some consulting. I think you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, my CPA license. I do have 3 additional letters behind my name, CFE, Certified Fraud Examiner. So I do some forensic audits. But from the audit standpoint, which is probably our largest service within our firm, we work for a variety of industries. Charter schools being probably our top niche within all the industries we work in, but we work with other nonprofits, for-profits, construction companies, things like that, manufacturing companies. We do retirement and benefit plan audits, but we do a variety of audits throughout the year. It makes things interesting from our standpoint.
So, you got how many people are in each office? What's kind of the breakdown?
So currently, Raleigh's about half our total firm, about 15 folks. Charlotte's about 10, 11, and then we have 3 or 4 down in Wilmington. That's a smaller operation, mostly tax operation, but kind of a breakdown there. Raleigh's mostly where our auditors are. Majority of that office is audit department. We have a few tax people there, and Charlotte's kind of the opposite. Most of the folks there are tax folks, and then we have a couple auditors up there.
So dealing with Raleigh, you still have relationships, I would imagine, in the government because you deal with audits. Are you able to call people up, or is there any communication between you and the state, or not really?
Sometimes, we've worked with the Department of Public Instruction in the past. They've asked some questions about, what we see as auditors, anything they can help with to assist us to make sure, charter schools are getting their audits in on time. You make sure, everything is they're coming up with from the compliance standpoint is correct, or if they think they didn't make any changes on their side. So we've been able to work with them over the last couple of years, to assist them and making sure, they're reviewing the audits and what they're looking for, and we can make sure, our clients are getting the best possible audit and getting information to them, and they're able to read the financial statements and understand what's going on with the charter school audits. As you well know, charter schools are nonprofit, but because of the government funding, they report on a government standards. So their audits kind of look a lot like the school system audits. And so, it's a little bit different looking at a governmental audit versus, a regular nonprofit or a regular for-profit audit.
Well, that was my first exposure coming from the private sector, and then looking at the books, 25 years ago, and seeing the transition of just a totally different way of accounting for things, and the literally 3 different budgets within one budget. So for people that are not familiar with the public sector audit or finance methodology going into charter schools, how do you deal with new charters that are coming in and try to help them understand that? We were at a charter school advisory board meeting years ago, and one of my associates on the board mentioned that they've been in business for years and never filed a 990 because why do we have to file taxes? We're not for profit. So how do you kind of walk new schools into this brave new world of charter school finance?
Yeah, that's a great question, because nonprofit, reporting, governmental reporting is completely opposite for-profit reporting in some instances. Especially new charter schools, starting out before they even get going or operations, there's some things they need to be aware of from, regulation standpoint. Especially you just mentioned, 990s and taxes. All nonprofits, or majority of nonprofits, are required to file an annual 990 tax return with the Internal Revenue Service. Now, the degree of that return depends on the operations, but it's very important that charter schools understand that, because that is an informational tax return. In some cases, they may actually pay taxes if they have something called unrelated business income, which has any revenues associated with any kind of activity not associated with their mission, which obviously instructing students is it's charter school's primary missions. But they have to be aware that 990 tax return is public knowledge. Anybody can look up those 990s once they're filed up with the Internal Revenue Service. And the numbers do come from the audit, but there's a lot of information on there. And that's why we call it an informational tax return, because there's a lot of additional information, such as information about the board, any key management figures, at the school, things like that. But when starting a school, they got to understand, even if they, the first year before they start operations, they may have some transactions going on. And while that's not required to be audited, they're still required to file a 990. And it's very important because we've seen some schools fail to do that, and they'll get their, nonprofit status revoked temporarily and have to go through all the paperwork to get it reinstated. So they need to really understand that 990 is important if they have any operations that first year. And it's important, starting out, that management and those charged in governance understand the financial reporting rules and the compliance rules that charter schools have to follow. Now, I mean, you've served on boards, Paul, as well as I have, and you don't want a board of 12 accountants. Obviously, that would be boring. But you do want somebody financially savvy on your board that can explain that to the other board members, because they are charged in governance. They do have some responsibility, for the overall school operations, but also for the financial piece for the operations of a school.
Well, and to that point, what a number of people don't understand is that you are a fiduciary on these companies. So sitting on the board, it's not just, wow, I get to put that on LinkedIn, I'm on a charter school board. You are a fiduciary if you are a voting member of that board, of that corporation, and your actions, I believe, is it 7 years? You can go there, you can go back 7 years on the actions of a board member. So it's critical. I mean, I sit on a board of an organization, and I just realized, so the first question is always you have directors and officers of insurance. And the board of this organization was not, they just got liability insurance and not D&O. And I tried to explain, I'm not on the board, I'm just a member of this group. And I set up the board meeting. I said, I would really suggest strongly that you get your D&O, and that you really dig into this a little deeper, and don't just think that it's going to roll on without any issues. So do you have any, do you do any kind of training or do any pre-setup work, or have any kind of brochures or something on your website or something in person that you do to deal with schools that are in the application process or in their first year, and then maybe every 5 years, maybe sit down with the board and do kind of a session discussing the rules of audits and 990s? Is that something that you do or consider doing?
Yeah, so we really do that in three phases. It's a requirement now that the board meets with a CPA before, during the filing process and the application process, to understand what we're just talking about, understand the fiduciary responsibility, understand what an audit is, and
So
understand what a
it's
90 is.
statutory, is this an OCS rules? It's statutory. If you could kind of dig into that too, please.
Yeah, I mean, that's more from the Office of Charter Schools is requiring that during the application process, that they meet with the CPA, and the CPA signs off that they presented something to the board, going over the audit procedures, going over the audit, regulations, going over the 990 with them, and kind of understanding their role as those charters and governance. And this was just, kind of included a couple years ago, or something before it was not a requirement. And I think it's a great requirement,
Right.
because we see a lot of schools struggle to start out with because they didn't have an understanding of the financial aspects, and now they do, and there's less chance they're going to struggle because of that. But we do present to the boards during that process, and we're always able to present to anybody wants us to come in and kind of give a reminder, because obviously beginning, the board may change. That boards members rotate in and out, and we'll give reminders every few years of what the audit is, what the 990 is. But even more importantly, I try to present the audit and the results of the audit to the board on an annual basis. Some schools, require that. Some schools just ask, and some want to see the auditor every couple of years. But I think it's very important that the board understands the results of the audit each year. And I say it only takes me 10, 15 minutes to present the audit, and it's a very 10 or 15 minutes critical time for the boards kind of have a chance to ask the auditor questions. And so we do all three phases, just kind of a upfront annual presentation, and just kind of a more detailed presentation every few years as requested by the schools.
So explain, if you would, what do you do in an audit? Because you're not doing an analysis of the company. You're not saying, oh, you're running this program effectively and efficiently. Oh, you can improve in this area. So there's two separate animals. So if you could kind of just dig in a bit more of what you actually do in an audit, and then something that I think is important for these schools too. And I don't know if this is something you do separately, or if this is something you work with the financial management firms. But the audit is one thing, but how do you dig in and show a school where you're way too high in your facilities management, or you're spending too much on staffing in this area? So it's two separate worlds. If you can kind of explain each and a little more depth so people understand it a bit better.
Absolutely. And a lot of people don't know what an audit is. The whole point of hiring an auditor is to give an opinion on the financial statements. And hopefully that's a clean opinion. Most of the time it is, but we run on occasion where it's not a clean opinion. But as auditors, we are trying to get comfortable with the numbers, that they are materially correct. And report, obviously that's going to be reported to the state. We're going to do our testing procedures, whether it's over assets, liabilities, revenues, expenses, to get comfortable with those numbers. We don't look at every single transaction. I think that's a big misconception, is the auditor comes and looks at every single transaction. That's not, it would take us forever to do each audit, and it would cost schools a lot of money to do that. And no auditor is ever going to look at everyone. We do sample. We do pay attention to the higher risk areas and the material balances. But charter schools are unique, as we've talked about, because of the state appropriations. Not only do you have a financial audit, most schools, because of the state appropriations they're spending, have to have a state single audit. And that's more compliance related. We may be looking at things such as insurance levels. We may be looking if they have sports programs, whether concussion forms are filled out correctly. And the compliance requirements are really dictated by the state. They update those on an annual basis. And we go through that what we call a compliance supplement, and make sure the school is following the rules with all those areas. In addition, a third audit that may occur, and we've seen an uptick on these in the last couple of years because of pandemic and COVID funding, is a federal single audit. And that's when a school spends more than $750,000 with federal funds. And that's more compliance testing we have to do as auditors. And it's important that those charged in governance and management understand the reporting requirements there. Because, like I said, federal single audits, we had before 2020, we didn't see very many schools having them. We probably have one school a year that would have a federal single audit. But since then, we've probably seen about half the schools have to have them because of the COVID funding. But it's really a three-part or two-part audit. It's compliance and financial related.
So what about where you can go in? Is this something you might do as a separate contract, or work with another firm, financial management firm, to go in and do an analysis and efficiency, basically? This is where your numbers are. These are your percentages on these different line items. These are industry standards. This has been your history. This is where you're going, which is a completely different animal. That's a financial management tool as opposed to an audit. Does anybody do that in the state that you're aware of, or are there any schools that you've seen do that?
We've seen some schools have that done, not too many, to be honest with you. That is something obviously we're able to do on the other side, because it's more consulting. As auditors, we have to remain independent. That's why any public or anybody relying on the audited financial statements feel comfortable they can rely on it, because we state we're independent. We don't have any conflicts of interest with that school. Obviously, that's something we probably couldn't do for our clients that we do the audits for, but that's something we could do for other schools that have other auditors. And because we work with so many schools, we have a good benchmark on how schools are spending their money, where they're concentrating their levels at. So that's something definitely we could help schools with, and looking at their finances and making sure they're focused in the right direction and they're reaching benchmarks. Because as dealing with so many schools, we see a vast array of schools spending in one area or not spending enough in the other area, and we're able to tabulate our findings from the throughout the audits to come up with a good benchmark for where schools should be at and where some schools are obviously not or maybe overspending in certain other areas. But that's something we could do. But it'd be happy with clients that we don't do the audit for.
So how many, oh, so you do bookkeeping services for some schools and not the audits, or?
We don't do any bookkeeping services. There's some good management companies throughout North Carolina that do that. We solely provide the audit and 990 services. We can consult with charter schools, but we don't actually perform any bookkeeping currently with charter
So
schools.
how many schools over the last, you've been with other firms, but you personally and the firms you've been with, what is the ballpark number of audits you think you've done over the last 27 years for charter schools?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that question. I think from 2000 to 2020, I probably averaged working on about 20 audits a year. Those numbers have grown. We are currently up to about 60 charter schools we work with. We've grown substantially over the last couple of years. This is the area we target because, quite frankly, I enjoy working at charter schools. They're not cookie cutter in my opinion. Everybody does things differently. The philosophies are different. The education mission's different. The way they're run's different, and obviously, it's different locations throughout the state. So I really enjoy working at charter schools because,
So you
you
get
know,
punishment, is what
yes,
you're saying.
absolutely. But yeah, we're about up to 60. I say we probably averaged 40 over the last 4 years.
Fantastic. So with that deep bench of schools that you've worked with, are you able to share maybe one or two really positive stories and maybe one or two horror stories that people should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave names out, obviously, but schools, having worked with so many of them, we've seen a lot of schools I've worked with for years that, started out small and have just grown substantially because they offer such a positive education experience. They have a good reputation. And, some of them have struggled at the beginning. And some of the things I go through in my audit presentation and when I talk to boards at the beginning is, here's some key metrics you need to look at financially. And if you're not meeting those metrics, you need to really look at your budget and how you can meet those. I think some schools, at the beginning, it's hard not to spend all the money they get. But I think it's always important for any, whether it's a charter school or for-profit or a nonprofit, to have some cash reserves in place for rainy days. I always say, anywhere from 3 to 6 months of cash reserves is important because there are going to be rainy days out there. And there's some other metrics that we look at is how you spend your money,
It's essentially
instructional.
which is essentially what bond covenants are.
Yes. Yeah. Bond covenants. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the other thing. Most schools start out renting spaces that don't necessarily fit the best arena for teaching kids. And, as they build up momentum, build up their finances, they go out for the, financing for the new buildings, whether it's bonds, notes. Unfortunately, you probably already well know the state doesn't supply very much capital outlay funds, if any, to charter schools, and because of that, they're already behind, with public school systems because they're not receiving any help with their capital outlay, and so they got to come up with this money themselves, through debt. To build the school buildings, and we've seen some great school buildings being built. We've seen some great schools. Urare Academy in Ashburn, and their campus is just huge. They continue adding students. It's been a great school to work with just because they've grown substantially throughout the years.
Sharon's doing a great job there. Very good. The so, what are your thoughts, or if you could just kind of touch a bit on the ending of the ESSER funding, or what some people are calling the ESSER cliff? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like we talked about, unfortunately, that's coming to an end. Schools who budgeted those separate as just special funds are going to be more successful than those that tried to include those in regular operations because there is a cliff. Those funds are going away. You're no longer going to have those. Schools that use those to benefit upgrading their schools and spending them correctly and getting them in the right place are going to be in good shape. But those that, hey, we want to include these in regular operations to supplement what was going on before are going to be in trouble because they're gone and they no longer have any funds to replace those. So hopefully schools do a good job of budgeting those, but that's going to be an issue I think moving forward for especially smaller schools that don't have as big of a budget. And because as you know, charter school budgets are tight. You only receive funding from certain places. I mean, some schools do a good job of fundraising, but for the most part, it's state, federal, local appropriations that they're
Well,
receiving,
it's
and their income.
60 to 68% of the funding levels that traditional district schools get. So it's a substantial difference. Plus, you have to pay for all your facilities out of that money. As to our district schools, their facilities are provided rent free. So it's as big.
Yeah, and you're asking about car stories earlier a few minutes ago. I think one of the areas we've seen charter schools have issues is when they get in trouble financially, they start borrowing money, and they start borrowing money at high interest rates. Even I mean, we already know high interest rates are high right now, but kind of interest rates that you really can't pay that money back, and they just get themselves in a bigger hole. So the schools got to be aware, like when they borrow money, look at those interest rates, look at the terms, go out and try to get the best terms possible because interest, is a waste of money in my opinion. You're not paying toward anything besides borrowing money, and so that can get yourself in a deeper hole, a hole that you might not be able to get out of. So pay attention and do not try to borrow money for operations if you don't have to. For capital needs, that's one thing, but if you're borrowing money for operations, that's a red flag.
Well, and at some point in those situations, when reality hits, it's just you need to try and see if you can find a management company to take it over, which 9 times out of 10 they won't if they're that far gone. Or sometimes it's unfortunate, but that is the marketplace. If you're not succeeding and you're not making your numbers, then you go out of business. So therein lies the key difference with charter schools, obviously, is that the marketplace takes them out if they're not performing. So
yes,
that
is true.
Is a key component to that because you're kind of the canary in the coal mine to see if people are complying with what needs to be done in the marketplace to survive and be strong in order to, again, carrying out the mission, as you said earlier. That's the point of these schools, to do unique, wonderful things with these kids and give them a great, unique education. But you cannot do that unless you run an effective and efficient business. So at the end of the day, I mean, you've got to have your business running well. So to that end, where do you see charter schools? Because this past year was a very positive year. Upcoming, you've got the ESSER cliff. You've got elections, which might change the dynamic, and you've got some other state level things going on that might change the dynamic. So where do you see us in the next decade as charter schools in North Carolina specifically?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've seen a substantial growth in the charter school market, especially, it's been a long time since they've lifted that cap. And I think we're going to continue to see that growth because parents, and I have 3 kids that have gone through the education system or are currently in it. They want options, and they want the best options for their kids to get the best education possible. And there's some schools throughout North Carolina that not only are great schools in North Carolina, they're nationally ranked schools. And this positive traction, I think, is just going to lead to more and more schools moving forward, which is a good thing. Competition is a good thing, in my opinion. It's always a good thing to have competition because at the end of the day, if private schools, charter schools, school systems are competing for these students, everybody wins because that means the kids are getting the best possible education. And this, charter schools are just another component of that competition unit to get kids educated. I think COVID had a negative effect on education for a couple of years there, and I think we're getting back on the right track. But charter schools are part of that solution.
That's a great way to wrap. I couldn't have said it any better. That was wonderful. Thank you. So really, thank you very much for your time and for providing the fantastic service that you provide for the charter schools in the state and therefore to our children and our communities. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you for having me on. Paul, always good to talk to you.
Great to speak to you too. Have a great weekend.
You too. Thank you.